Comparison is a thief of joy, as the old adage goes, and today's gospel demonstrates that clearly. And yet, compare we do. We notice who has what we do not, who's recognized or lauded, and no one living or those who have passed from this life have never felt a twinge of envy. And research in the animal kingdom confirms that they too experience jealousy, a sense of what is fair and unfair. It's really interesting. Recent research on capuchin monkeys bore this out. Let me tell you what they did to these two little guys. They kept them in separate crates, and if they would give the owner a rock, just pass them a rock, then they would give them a little piece of cucumber, which to that kind of monkey is quite a delicacy. So they would give it, they'd get a cucumber, and both started out the same. Then after a little while, they would ask for a rock, and when the rocks were given, one would be given a cucumber and one would be given a grape. A cucumber is a nice snack, and a grape is like caviar in the monkey world. And the monkey that got the cucumber would look over quite disturbed. And then, to make matters worse, they started giving grapes to the one monkey for doing nothing. You didn't have to pass a rock or anything. And the monkey became irate and started throwing stones. You can look this up at YouTube. If you want to see monkeys in unfair treatment, look it up on YouTube and you can watch the monkeys. This is such a part of not just human nature, but of animal nature too. I know this in myself, not that I'm going to tell you what irks me more than almost anything else, is when I'm driving through construction and there is a sign that says, merge right, left lane closed. And I merge because I follow directions. And then people who have also seen that sign, and I'm guessing they are sighted people because they're driving vehicles, they pull up by me and want to cut in, and cut in, and cut in. And so that I'm standing still and like a row of cars is cutting in. So I am deaf, I don't hear you. But you know what? I know sign language, and I get some signs. So here I am. I'm at the back of the line. I've done what I'm supposed to do, and I followed the directions. And all of these people are getting to their destinations faster than me. So, added to that innate sense of fairness that we all have, we also have this cultural message in America that if you work hard to get ahead, that hard work will be rewarded with success. And it doesn't look at it as though some people start at a different place than others. It is so bound up in that Protestant work ethic and in a sense that everyone who wants to get ahead will get ahead and can. Hard work brings success, and for some, success is a sign of God's favor. But I hope we understand that everyone is not given the same opportunities in this life and that our advantages are not the same. I taught for many years social policy, and a book that I used to teach that was written by Jansen, and it was called The Reluctant Welfare State, about America. And welfare not in terms of a program where people are given, wages or whatever from that, entitlements, but welfare like the care of others, okay? Does everyone have access to medical care? Does everyone have a fair chance at employment and education and those kind of things? And it was so surprising to students to read about the history of different presidential reigns and what policy came out of those reigns, because they would come into it with this idea, we live in a fair world, don't we? Everyone gets the same. So here we are approaching this parable of Jesus, and we come to it with these personal feelings about fairness that are just part of who we are, and equity. And then we have ingrained views of our economic system that can sway our interpretation here. So I feel like we must start out by declaring that this is not related to economic system per se, even though it has been used to support or criticize different economic systems throughout time. So let's momentarily lay aside our concept of what is a fair wage and hear this parable, if we can, with fresh ears. First, we have the setup. The parable follows the story of the rich young ruler who approaches Jesus with a desire to know salvation. And Jesus tells him that he's doing well on keeping the commandments and things, but there is one thing that he lacks. He holds on to his great wealth. So Jesus asks him to give it all away to the poor, and then when he's unburdened, come and follow Jesus. And the man walks away sad because wealth seemingly still holds him. Jesus then comments with sadness how hard it is to hold wealth and follow God. And Peter, who is the disciple that always seems to desire a mathematical equation of grace, asks what the reward will be for him and for the other disciples there because they've left everything to follow Jesus. And the parable today is Jesus' response. The parable setup. If you know anything about grapes, you know that the time between when they're ripe and when they're ruined is a short time. Harvesting has to happen at their peak. And so it's an urgent work, especially in a geographical area where fall rains threaten the crop if they're not picked before the rains start. So there's an urgency that drives this parable, this story that Jesus tells about the kingdom. He says right away, this is about the kingdom of God, so listen carefully to that. The landowner himself goes out looking for workers. We don't hear of a manager or helper until we hear at the end of the story that he calls him to give out the wages. But before that, it's the landowner himself that goes out to the marketplace looking for workers. Early in the morning, the landowner goes out looking for day laborers to work. And finding some, he contracts with them verbally for a denarius in some readings of this, or for a daily wage. It's equivalent to a generous day's work. He returns to the marketplace at 9 a.m., at noon, at 3, and at 5 o'clock, and each time he invites more people into the vineyard to work. Only this time he does not state the pay to these latter chosen workers, only that he will give them what is right, which we will read as fair, right? Day laborers were and are still in some places a particularly vulnerable group. They are not household employees, they're not even slaves of that time, where the house owner, the owner of the estate, would have to take care of them in some way. At least they would be given food and shelter and such protections as that. If no one hires a day laborer at this time, then they have no provisions for the day. There is nobody that takes care of them. There is no one that they belong to. There's no one watching out for them. They simply would not eat. They were very much at the mercy of the landowners who might have work for them, the landowners who might come and choose among them. And so they stand there waiting. The parable cautions us not to judge them as lazy for standing there all day without work. These chosen later in the day, that is. They're idle, but they're not idle for lack of industry, but for lack of opportunity. Because no one has hired us, they tell the landowner. And when it's time to pay up, and the landowner purposefully arranges the line so that those who've worked the least number of hours are first in the line, and people at the back of the line can see what everyone is being paid. This parable only works when you see it from the back of the line. If he had lined them up the other way, for instance, then those in the front would never know that those in the back had received something more generous. So those in the front and the rest of us likely would expect a percentage of the pay based on the number of hours worked. In the back of the line, their excitement grows and grows. Imagine how much they're expecting to get because they see that those that only worked an hour, starting at 5 o'clock and ending at 6, are given a full day's wages. And they've worked 12 hours, so they're maybe expecting 2 weeks' pay. But the excitement turns to bitterness and complaint as they too just received the agreed upon denarius for the full 12-hour day. It's not fair, they cry. And most people in the court of public opinion would say, no, that doesn't seem fair. And the landowner's response is maybe not as satisfactory as we might wish. He says, 1, you agreed upon this. 2, it's my money. Can't I do with it as I wish? And 3, are you jealous that I'm generous to the others? The answer to that is a resounding yes. They're jealous. Generous to those people up front, but not generous to us is how it feels. I expect that was their initial reaction. Notice that we're never told what the workers at the back of the line responded as they went home. We hear what the landowner said to them in response, but we don't know what their response that they take away is. Are they bitter still? Or are they recognizing finally that, well, they're going home with enough to feed themselves well for the day and their families? Did gratitude win that day? Maybe we're not told because we're to imagine ourselves at the back of the line, and the rest of the story lies in our hearts and our attitudes toward God. Focusing on unfairness makes us miss the gifts of God's grace and mercy in our own lives. Not wages, perhaps. We're not thinking in terms of wages, but comparison with others. Opportunities that are offered to others. I know several Christian parents who have walked away from God because they have prayed and prayed and prayed so long for their children, and their children are not followers of Jesus, at least not yet. And so they think, it's not fair. I have prayed for years about this. I know another family who owned a construction company, and he was so honest with everything that he did, but he was sued by a frivolous lawsuit. Actually, he was building a home for a famous lawyer in that area, and as the home was nearly finished, then the lawyer sued about something, saying the contract was not as he had designed it to be or whatever. And he lost his entire business and had to start over again in his mid-50s, which is a hard time to start over again in business like that. And he talked about, like, I don't know what I could have done anymore. I did everything as honestly and as well as I could. I left it in God's hands. And he felt like he was being punished. He felt like he deserved more. And if we're honest, sometimes all of us have situations in our lives where we feel like we deserve more than maybe the circumstances before us. And there's that word, deserve. And that's exactly what Peter was asking. We have been so faithful to you. Surely we get more than other people who are just signing on at the last minute, right? And Jesus tells this parable to show that the way jealousy works is that it changes our perception to a self-focused one where we calculate what we deserve rather than calculating the unnumbered blessings that God has put in our lives, the things that cannot be calculated. And can you hear echoes of Eden here? God generously in Eden provides everything that could be used for food, that was pleasant for the eye, that was a paradise, and yet there's one thing that I need, that I don't have. And that's where original sin comes in. That we look so often on the one thing we don't have, or the way we think God has cheated us. And for Adam and Eve, that tree became their focus. The last workers could have noticed that as the day went on, the work was shared by more and more people, and they benefited from that. There are more people in the vineyard. There are more people doing the work, even if they're starting at different times in the day. They might have rejoiced that they were well, even generously compensated for their day's work, that they had been given both provision and purpose. But a jealous eye robbed them of gratitude. They might have even been joyfully delighted that the latecomers also would have dinner that night and would not go hungry. Fellow humans, if they had looked with compassion at what the landowner had provided. But they did not look at what their neighbor needed. They looked at what they did not feel they had gotten. And they, like Peter, ask, what's in it for us if we're faithful? They were given grace, but to be truly transformational, grace must be deeply received, Michelle Barnwell says. Grace must be deeply recognized, that the gifts that we have must be deeply recognized, and gratitude wells up from that. Sin and grace are great levelers. Nothing is deserved, and nothing can be earned. And God, like the landowner in the parable, is not fair in the way that we judge fairness. And thanks be to God that God is not a fair God. We could not stand before God's fairness. How is it fair that God gives sinners like us heaven? How is it fair that the cost of our sins were laid on Jesus, pure and holy and innocent? That's not fair. It's beyond generous to us. We've received more, much more than we deserve. Douglas Webster writes this, mercy's minimum wage is always greater than merit's maximum compensation. There's a lot of M's in there. Let me say it again in case you missed it with my stumbling. Mercy's minimum wage is always greater than merit's maximum compensation. We're not serving God because God needs us. We're serving because God has invited us. God could do all that God needs to do or wants to do without our participation. But again and again, God calls and invites us into the work. Some of us have been invited long ago. Some of us have been invited a short term ago. And maybe some of you listening today don't even know that you have been invited, but you have. And I'm here to say that invitation to you, that God invites us graciously and generously into the work. And he asks us to extend that invitation to others, and that we rejoice in the grace and generosity that others receive. We recognize that, like the day laborers in the story, that we too would be without protection, without purpose, without provision, if not for God's gracious invitation to the vineyard, co-laboring in God's kingdom work. Every time we pray, give us this day our daily bread, we are remembering that we're invited by the loving landowner to have enough for today, enough of every grace for this day. We're also reminded that it is for us, not just for me. All of the pronouns in the Lord's Prayer are plural pronouns. Just like manna was rained from heaven for the Israelites as they were wandering in the desert, and quail sent into the camp, God provides daily. And so daily we remember. We may think we earn our pay because we go to work, and hopefully you earn a fair wage there. But really, even God gives the ability to do that. So all gifts are from the hand of God. The invitation still goes out, whether you were called first or last. And about that, Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first. But let's think about that for a minute, because unless you're jockeying for position and you keep like a relay race changing, then first and last are really only temporal terms that belong to this world and the sins of comparison and jealousy. Think about that. The only way that the first could be last and the last first is if we enter together. Linking arms, no line or queue where some people are at the back and other people are at the front. Everyone experiencing grace together, the generous care of God. And so that view from the back of the line is a gracious, gracious view.